Hey, what's up guys, TechTine here and I'm back again with a brand new video. Before I begin, I just want to thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed, consider doing so. A lot of great content is coming really soon. So with that being said, today we're going to be doing the comparison between the Moto G 5G versus the Moto G Power 2025 edition. And basically these phones do share some similarities, but they also have some, in my opinion, major differences. So let's have a conversation and talk about them. Strictly from a looks department, they do share a lot of characteristics and actually makes it a little bit more difficult to tell them apart, other than the colors and stuff like that. But basically the back, they both have a triple camera setup, but the Moto G Power does have a wide angle sensor versus the 2025 Moto G, which only has a macro sensor. But more on the cameras later in the video. And another kind of differentiating factor that is really small, basically the button layouts is basically the same buttons, but the Moto G Power does have this kind of hole on the side that I thought at first it was a microphone, but I guess it's actually like an air vent. That's a weird placement. On the bottom of the phones, you do have the same also port layout. Headphone jack, USB-C, microphone, and your bottom facing speaker. And the material of choice again is extremely similar. Not extremely similar, it's basically the same material of choice. So the same vegan leather, just different color palette. And essentially that's the big idea behind the design. So very similar kind of characteristics and themes in terms of looks, feels. The Moto G Power is a little bit larger at 6.8 inches versus the Moto G at 6.7 inches. And if we're looking at it from like a weight standpoint, I mean, the Moto G is 193 grams and the Moto G Power is slightly heavier at 208 grams. So yeah, that's essentially the design aspect of both of these phones. Let's switch the conversation and talk about the first major change, which is in the display of both of these devices. And this is really where the big changes take place. And so the Moto G 2025 model only has a disappointing 720p panel. It is an IPS panel. Does it get bright? It's fairly bright. It's not the brightest thing in the world, but it still is an IPS panel. It's decent as far as quality, but as far as resolution, it's just not it. So 1604 by 720, 262 pixels per inch at 6.7 inches of kind of display real estate. It does have a 120 hertz refresh rate, but with a low resolution, I don't think that really matters that much. The Moto G Power brings in a higher resolution display with a larger screen, so a 6.8 inch 2388 by 1080p, so a full HD display. Still has 120 hertz of refresh rate, but the bezels this time around are also thinner. So basically, putting these displays side by side, it's a little bit more challenging to kind of tell the resolution, especially when you're also watching this through a camera. But if we try to zoom in as much perspective as I can, zooming in a little bit further would give us a more kind of understanding of the difference between both of these displays. So one has a high resolution and one has smaller bezels. And if we look at it from numbers perspective, the Moto G Power does have a 3% less bezels than the Moto G and also has a larger footprint, or if that's something that you're looking for. But the display easily goes to the Moto G Power. The 720p panel is just trash on the Moto G. Resolution wise, is just not it. Okay, so now let's have the camera conversation. So they both have the same basically main sensor. So they both share like a 50 megapixel sensor at f1.8 aperture, and both support optical image stabilization. The first big difference here is that the Moto G Power does have an 8 megapixel ultra wide versus the 2 megapixel macro sensor that is almost useless on the Moto G. They both have the same ambient light sensor and your LED flash, but when putting these photos side by side, I'd say that the basic differences here are the fact that the Moto G Power does have a more warmer tone versus the standard Moto G. Now, as far as just quality itself, they're very freaking similar. It was hard for me to tell the difference just by having them side by side and just looking at the pictures. So you wouldn't go wrong from a photo standpoint with either one of these phones. Even when it comes to the video quality, they're extremely similar. I was hardly able to tell them apart. So camera wise, very similar. I do have to add that the Moto G Power gives you the upper hand just because it does have the ultra wide sensor. From a performance perspective though, here's what I have to say. If we just look at the numbers, they both have the same processor. They both use the MediaTek Dimensity 6300 processor. They both use the same GPU. One has 4 gigabytes of RAM versus the other, which has 8 gigabytes of RAM that is upgradable up to 24 gigabytes of RAM versus the up to 8 gigabytes of RAM using like RAM boost. But as far as just performance, yeah, no, they're not really that different. Opening up apps, closing them, going through social media, anything that has to do with just daily tasks and even gaming, very similar. I do have to give again the upper hand for the slight RAM boost on the Moto G Power. But from my perspective, very similar processing speed. Nothing has changed there, even when you do your synthetic benchmark. I do have to add that the Moto G Power does provide two advantages. One is that the Moto G Power does have IP68 water resistant certification versus the IP57, I believe, which is just a water repellent on the Moto G. In addition to that, the Moto G Power does take it a step further with adding a 15-watt wireless charging in addition to that 30-watt wire charging. But basically, from my point of view, if you were to buy, or if you're just in the market for a Motorola phone under $300 and you have only these two options, so let's cancel out all the other phone options in the world. Just look at these two perspectives. One, the Moto G is at $199. The Moto G Power is at $299. So for $100 more, you get wireless charging, you get a higher resolution display, and you get ultra wide if you want to count that as an additional feature. And also water resistance. Is that worth it for extra $100? To some people it might be, to others it might not. In my personal point of view, yes. If it means I get a 1080p display and I get wireless charging and I get water resistance, I think $100 is fair. So that's why I would pick the Moto G Power. But obviously, both of these phones also have their own separate issues. Now that we cancel out all the other phones out there, let's bring them back in. There are a lot of freaking options out there for $249 and $299 that do exactly what these phones do and then some. So with that being said, I want to thank you all so much for watching. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments below. Let me know, which phone would you choose if you had to pick one of these options? Or if you don't have to pick one of these options, which one would you personally choose to compete with these phones? Let me know in the comments below. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will definitely catch you guys in the next one.